This video will teach you how to assemble the Livingstone Coring device. To assemble the Livingstone corer, you'll start with the coring head. There is a small hole in one side of the beveled collar that the cable will pass through. At the top of the head, you'll see a square notch every 90 degrees, and if you look at the head from the bottom, you'll see that the notches are only 180 degrees apart. You'll want to make sure that the notches on the bottom of the head line up with the flanges on the sides of the square rod at the bottom. This way, when the head slides onto the rod, the head can then pass over those flanges on the rod. Be sure to maintain that orientation of the coring head and pass the rod up through the head. When you put the head on the rod, it's a good idea to slide the head all the way from the top of the square rod to the bottom to make sure that it is in the proper orientation before you move on to the next step. Once the head is on the rod, attach a nut to the threaded portion on the top of the square rod. To start, finger tight is fine, and once we get all the pieces in place, you can use the wrench to tighten the nut down onto the threaded portion of the rod. After the nut, you'll add the drive rod connector. This is the adapter that puts the proper threads on the top of the square rod to feed into the standard drive rod. You'll want to make sure that the drive rod connector threads all the way down against the nut and then give it a little bit of a tightening with a wrench to make sure that it stays in place. Next, you will thread the cable through the small hole at the top of the core head. This clip shows a Bolivia coring device with the barrel already in place, but the cable threading process is the same for the Livingstone coring head. Thread the cable through the small hole in one side of the beveled collar of the core head. You'll need to thread this all the way down to the bottom of the square rod. This can be done before or after attaching the core barrel to the head. Make sure that you have enough cable in place. Next, you will attach the steel barrel for the Livingstone by passing it over the cable and the square rod all the way up to the top, where it will slide onto the head. Make sure that you have the holes in the proper orientation to then attach the screws. There are 3 screws that hold the barrel in place. It's a good idea to get all 3 of them loosely in place before tightening them down with a screwdriver so that you have a little bit of wiggle room to assure proper alignment. For this, you'll need a flathead screwdriver. The additional holes that you see in the side of the barrel allow for the tube to fill with water when you are collecting the core to keep it from being buoyant. Once all the screws are loosely in place, you can then rotate the barrel around and tighten them all down using a screwdriver. The next step is to add the piston to the bottom of the cable. You'll need to make sure that you can reach the end of the cable from the bottom of the coring tube. You can thread additional cable through the head if needed to give yourself a little more cable to reach. It is possible for the square rod to settle on top of the cable, which makes it difficult to push through, so rotating the barrel around can help you push the cable the rest of the way through. The free end of the cable passes through the top of the piston. Give yourself enough slack to then tie a figure-8 knot in the cable and then pull that tight. You'll pull it finger tight, and then when you pull back up against the piston, you'll be able to pull out a little more of the slack. Once you have the knot up against the center portion of the piston, we use electrical tape to hold the tail of the cable in place so that the free end of the cable doesn't interfere with the operation of the piston. The next step is to slide the piston into the core barrel. Be careful with the end of the core barrel during this process as it is sharp. To adjust the tightness of the black rubber gaskets on the piston, we use a 3/4 inch crescent wrench. It can be helpful to have a second person pull the cable at the top of the tube to help get the piston in. You'll want to verify the tightness of both the upper and lower gaskets. You want it to be a little bit difficult to push in without having too much pressure needed to be applied to get the piston in. It should have enough friction that it provides suction to keep the core in, but not too much that it is difficult to push the core into the sediment. A vice grip can be used on the nose cone of the piston to push it into place so that you don't risk squishing your fingers between the sharp end of the core barrel and the piston.